Thank you for joining us today at this very special event by Professor Barbara Oakley, organized by ReallyLesson, Coursera, and the Institute of Adult Learning.
Professor Barbara Oakley is a distinguished educator, writer, professor of engineering. She is one of Coursera's top instructors with more than 3.8 million learners, more than Singaporeans. She's also New York Times best-selling author. And she's amazing. So today she's here to share with us her insights on accelerate your learning with generative AI, transformative potential of Gen AI, and enhancing the ability to learn. So without further ado, can you join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Barbara Oakley, please. Professor, thank you.
Let's begin by talking about Fei Li's memorable quote. And that is that AI will not replace humans, but humans who can use AI will replace those who don't. And the fact of the matter is, there is so much great use for AI that the wave is here. We can't stop it. So we need to learn to live with it. And as you do, you'll find it has great advantages. The great thing about online teaching is not only can students get together from virtually anywhere, but even professors can have very different backgrounds. Now, to my surprise, I was invited to speak at Harvard. I was a nervous wreck because, it's Harvard. And so I walked in the room and I was even more nervous because it was packed. Standing room only, all around the edges. And I thought, why are there so many people here? Turns out our one little course made for virtually nothing, mostly in my basement, that's my basement, had on the order of the same number of students as all of Harvard's massive open online courses and online courses put together, made for millions of dollars with hundreds of people. And what this tells you is that learners around the world are starved for solid, research-based insights from neuroscience that they can use practically in their everyday life. It not only helps you learn better, it helps you to be more productive. So Terry and I have lots of courses on Coursera. We've got courses about how to teach well online, all growing from neuroscience, how to upskill, that's mind shift in your job. And if you have children, there's a special learning how to learn course for youth. But I'm actually here to talk about something quite different. I'm here to talk about what does ChatGPT do? So a lot of you probably know that it works by predicting the next word. Somehow, magically, they train it so it will predict the next word. There's a lot more that's going on, though. So generative AI is able to relate the words within sentences via an approach that uses word vectors. Now, I'm going to anthropomorphize. In other words, I'm going to speak of computers and generative AI as if it was a human. And it's not a human, but it makes it easier if I speak about it that way. So I just want that little warning up front. But anyway, do you remember about 5 years ago, if you went to like Google Translate and asked it to translate something, it would be terrible. And why is it so much better now? If you look, 5 years ago, the way that computers paid attention to a sentence was that it would pay attention, and then by the time it would get to the end of a sentence, it would forget what was at the beginning of a sentence. So as you can imagine, it's pretty hard to translate if you forget what you're translating. But now, using clever embedding techniques, the attention of a computer can be not only on entire sentences, but on entire essays and even large swaths of the internet. So how did this happen? I'm going to give you a teeny tiny history lesson in how generative AI evolved. So back in 2017, there was a paper published called Attention is All You Need. Terry Sinowski is the president of the Neural Information Processing Society, and the conference there is where this paper was published. And when this paper was put forth to the reviewers, nobody thought it was anything important at all. So they said, oh, that paper, that's just going to be a little poster session. It'll be off in the corner. A grad student presented it. But this paper is so important that it has now been cited over 100,000 times. And it introduced this incredible idea of the transformer. So what's the transformer? First, before I introduce the transformer, I want to show you what the transformer can do. It's very creative in a human-like way. So have any of you seen the website Suno? So some of you have. Okay. So I went to Suno and I entered in Attention is All You Need, that paper title, and I told it a little bit about what transformers do, and this is the song that resulted.
Recurrent thoughts, they go in loops, caught up in endless feedback hoops, decoding life through tangled webs.
It's actually really creative and kind of cool. So do you have a husband or wife or boyfriend or girlfriend, someone you'd like to impress? Put their name in and talk a little bit about their characteristics. You can write a song for them, and suddenly you are like the most creatively wonderful person around. So what's behind this creative enterprise? The transformer consists of two parts, fundamentally. One part is the encoder. That's what takes our prompt. So I put in a prompt that might be, what's the best restaurant in Singapore? Of course, it would be arguing with itself about the best restaurant. So my input comes in, and incidentally, I don't know if you can see it, but that little circle, it says positional encoding. That's where the magic is inserted that provides a numerical vector that quantifies the relationship of all the words with other words. But anyway, so we put in our positional or our input, and the prompt goes in, and then out of the output comes, so it's the decoder gives us the answer to whatever question that we might have asked. Now, what is interesting for us from our perspective is that the flow of information through that transformer is remarkably similar to the flow of information through the brain. So what that means is that if you understand a little bit about how the brain works, you can actually use generative AI better. So let's dive in. For a few of you, this is going to be a little bit of quick review, but don't worry, we'll go on to new things. But I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the brain is really complex, but if we focus in on the fundamental building block, at least from our perspective, it is the neuron. There's about 86 billion neurons, and this is like neuroscience in 20 seconds. So you have legs on your neurons, and those are called dendrites. You have little toes coming off your dendrites. You'll see the use of these toes later on. And then there's an arm that reaches out called an axon. And what neurons do is they like to send signals, and now you can see that electrical signal that jumps the gap with neurotransmitters and goes on to the next neuron. And what neurons are really doing is when you are learning something, you are creating sets of links, like a clump of connected neurons in long-term memory. So whether you're learning how to take a dance step or how to conjugate a verb in a foreign language, how to take a derivative in math, whatever you're learning, you are simply creating connections in long-term memory. Now, you will have experts in education and psychology coming and telling you, you don't need to clutter your students' brains by having them remember things because they can always look things up. That's a problem. If you don't have those links in long-term memory, you are not truly an expert. Let's say that I'm trying to learn to speak Mandarin. Would I speak Mandarin if I actually just went to Google Translate and used Google Translate to look it up for me? Of course not. You need to have those sets of links within your long-term memory to be an expert in anything. And how do we strengthen those links between neurons? Well, we just practice. Practice, but practice in the right way. Do you practice with concept maps? My audience is so smart. No, you do not practice with concept maps. You practice with retrieval practice, seeing if you can pull it from your own memory. The concept map people are so good at PR. All educators are told that concept mapping is the best approach, but guess what? It actually is not, as research shows. So if you ask me more about it during the question period, I'll go on a rant. So let's say that you don't practice, that you don't retrieve. So for example, I had one of my students, when I was giving a test, after I gave a test on engineering statistics, he comes marching up to me after the test and says, how could I flunk this test? And I'd redlined it, and he'd done terribly. He said, how could I have flunked this test? I understood it when you said it in class. We've gotten so overboard with conceptual understanding is the only important thing that we've forgotten that memory is also important. If you don't get those concepts in your long-term memory, you have not learned it, even if you really understood it before. So if you don't practice it, like that student didn't practice it, he just learned it in class or thought he did, then didn't look at it again for 2 weeks, and here's what happened in between. You know, his little synaptic janitors just swept those dendritic spines away, and what he maybe even really did know didn't matter because he forgot it. So what we're trying to do with our students is to create nice, thick, rich sets of links that we can easily pull to mind. And I should say that if I look at my colleagues in my School of Engineering, if you look all through the US in schools of science, technology, engineering, and math, who are most of the professors? They're not from the US. They're from countries like Singapore that still do value rote learning, some degree of rote learning, of having to remember things. So you're doing good, keep it up. But this brings me to a way, though, that memory of things can actually be used creatively. And this relates to the value of metaphor. So metaphor is, I'm going to give you a simple example. When you were a little kid, you played with water. You watched it. And now the idea of the flow of water seems really simple and straightforward. But you can use that idea of current, water current, to more easily introduce the idea of electrical current flow. So like if there's points in common between something you already know and a new concept you're trying to introduce, students can pick up on it much more easily. So I'll give you an example of how I learned about this. So when I was working on the book A Mind for Numbers, one thing I should mention is, so Penguin Random House told me, we're going to name the book A Mind for Numbers. And I thought, that is the world's most boring title for a book. Because it's about not only learning in math and science, but learning languages, learning all sorts of different things. And in fact, if you Google A Mind for Numbers, you will find it in obituaries all over the place. You know, this book is going to go nowhere. But it's now sold over 1 million copies worldwide, and I'll tell you why. It's not me. It's the many people who helped inform that manuscript. Because what I did was I reached out to thousands of top teachers and professors who were well known for being able to communicate ideas effectively and be really effective teachers. And I asked them to look at my manuscript and give me any advice and any thoughts they might have. And they gave me some great suggestions. But one thing they commonly said that surprised me was, I do this one little thing, but I don't tell other professors I do it. And what was that one little thing? It was the use of metaphor and analogy. And why did they not tell their colleagues? Not because they were trying to keep it to themselves, but because their colleagues would go, well, that's why you're seen as such a good teacher. You make it so easy for your students. But isn't that our job, to make things easier for our students? A recent meta-analysis came out and concluded, after studying thousands of research papers, guess what? Learning is really hard. And so if we can find ways to sort of, like a shovel, help put things more conveniently into students' heads, that's what we want to be doing. So the thing is, though, metaphors always do break down. So our water is like electrical current flow. Example will break down at a quantum level. But whenever a metaphor breaks down, you just throw it away. You get a new metaphor. But good luck finding a metaphor for quantum physics. So how do you get metaphors? I used to say, well, there's lots of metaphor websites, like you can go to computer science, and there's metaphors for computer science, metaphors for chemistry, or for teaching economics, and so forth. But now, you can just go to ChatGPT. It's fantastic. So let's give one example. Let's say you're teaching nursing. So you want your nurses to understand that if you catch those early signs of sepsis, it will help you to put that fire out before it blows into a gigantic conflagration that kills your patient. So if you use this idea of, oh, there's a forest fire, hey, if you see the first smoke signals, go after that fire, you can actually save patients' lives. Student nurses can get this idea more easily. But let's go to like computer science. Let's say you're trying to teach Python programming, and so you're trying to explain the difference between main guard and scope in Python programming. Well, how do you do that? A good metaphor is that main guard is like the gatekeeper of a castle, and scope is like those rooms within a castle. And then, of course, it gives you a lot more information besides. What do marketing companies for big pharmaceutical firms, they have a really difficult job. They have to teach in a commercial how a drug might work, but they have to do it really, really quickly. So they will spend weeks coming up with just the right metaphor to be able to convey that idea quickly. Now, you don't need to spend weeks coming up with just the right metaphor because you can go to one of the engines and ask it. And don't just ask for one metaphor. Ask for like 5 or 10, and then dive more deeply into the one that you like. The way I would like you to think about these large language models is that they're like different engines in a car. And those different engines, you think about it, if you learn to drive and then you get in a car with a different engine, the driving skills are still pretty much the same. So it's like that with large language models. You learn to drive one large language model, it's pretty similar to other large language models. Are there slight differences? Yes, there are slight differences. I'll give you one example. So there's a very famous episode where the president of OpenAI, which makes the engine Claude, he's actually ChatGPT, OpenAI of ChatGPT. You can tell I'm biased towards Claude. And so he put in his little notebook that there was, a make a joke website. Took a picture of his notebook and then uploaded it to ChatGPT. ChatGPT generated all the code you needed for a website. So here's what I did. I took a picture of that picture and I loaded it on ChatGPT just to see if it would do as had been advertised. And sure enough, it generated all the code you need for creating a joke website, just from a little picture that says create a joke website. Then I loaded the same picture onto Claude, and I asked it to create a joke website. You know what Claude did? Claude came back to me and said, "Oh, you have a joke website? People's feelings could be hurt with some of these jokes. I'm not going to do it." And I had to argue with Claude to say, "Oh, so what? You want a humorless world?" So there are substantive differences in how these large language models are trained. And so that's why you want to explore some of those different engines, even if they fundamentally work in similar ways. So let's look more internationally. At least right now, it's really expensive to develop a large language model. So a lot of very profitable companies are, no surprise, affiliated with a lot of the large language models that we see coming out. Like Google they've created Gemini, and Amazon is affiliated with Claude. Interestingly, remember that paper I told you about from 2017, Attention is All You Need? If you look at the authors of that paper, they were mostly from Google. And Google looked at that paper, looked at transformers and said, it seems too complicated. We're not going to do it. So some of them went off, started up Anthropic, joined OpenAI, and that was the seed that helped begin generative AI at these different companies. So, of course, then there's Llama from Meta. And on the Chinese side, there's equivalent, really strong and good large language models. So at present, these are the big 7. I should say that Mistral is blowing in from France. So even in the last couple months, they've started to become very strong. So you'll be seeing this shift, but this gives you a pretty good snapshot of what's happening now. Now, I've tried to give you a sense of the token limit, which relates to the context window and these are the official numbers. I think sort of, they're a little bit different if you go and practice, but you can't really find good numbers because a lot of companies don't really want to release them. But what is a token limit or the context window? It relates to how much stuff you can put up and how much stuff you can take out at one time. So I'll give you an example of why this, why this is important. So so there's the book I have with my co-authors on common sense teaching, and the Japanese publisher reached out to me and said, I would like you to write a foreword for Japanese readers of this book. I'm like, I don't know anything about the Japanese educational system. How can I write a foreword for Japanese readers? So what did I do? Now, if you look, so at that time, Claude was known, like you might think, oh, I'm going to go to Gemini because I can put up a whole bunch of material at once. It's got 1 million tokens. A token is like 3/4 of a word. So you can kind of roughly think of them as word equivalents. So you might think, oh, I'm going to always use Gemini because they have a big, you can put a lot of gas in that gas tank. But actually, so far, I haven't been so impressed that Gemini is as good as Claude or ChatGPT. Here's what Claude can do. So not long ago, the engineers working with Claude loaded 1 million garbage words with one sentence that made sense. Then they asked a question that could only be answered by that one sentence. So they asked the question of Claude, Claude answered it, and then completely unsolicited, Claude came back and said, you put 1 million words of garbage in here just to see if I could pick out that one sentence. So it is somehow in the training and tuning of Claude, it's a bit different from ChatGPT. I like ChatGPT if I want straight facts. But if I'm looking, let's say I load a research paper on, and I want it to give me the key ideas of that research paper. Claude will give me key ideas. ChatGPT will summarize the paper. And that's really quite different. It wasn't what I was looking for. So play with the engines. Also, Claude is not updated as recently. It's hard to tell because they keep changing, but it may be a couple years old as far as when it was trained. So it won't know very recent facts. ChatGPT is trained sometime this year, from what I understand. So it will have much more recent facts. Grok, that's Grok, that platform is supposed to be very good for being very recent in its updates. So anyway, my Japanese publisher asked me to write the foreword for the Japanese version of the book. And I was able, because of Claude's large context window, I was able to upload a PDF of the entire book, and I asked it to analyze it and tell me how our book supported traditional ways of teaching in Japan, and how it brought new ideas from neuroscience that were not conventionally used within the Japanese education system. Well, I got the results, wrote them all up, nice forward, sent it to my Japanese editor, and she goes, how do you know so much about the Japanese schools, educational system? And I was just like, I'm good. So this is what I'm talking about when I say that it can really help you be more creative. It's like an assistant that knows an incredible amount, but as you will see, it's an assistant that's extremely helpful, except when it's a little psychopathic. So anyway, in 2023 alone, there were 149 foundational large language models released. So if you're overwhelmed sometimes, that's why. I tend to focus on the ones that have either a lot of money or they've got someone who is from a really, really knowledgeable background. So what is a large language model? If we can look at the human brain, we can begin to understand what a large language model is. So the thing is, I had mentioned that we have links laid in long-term memory when we learn something, but there's actually two ways that those links are laid. So the thing is, I don't expect you to remember the names of the different parts of the brain and so forth that I'll be mentioning. But what I do want you to remember is that there are two pathways that we use for learning. And interestingly, if you're talking about neurotypical versus neuroatypical students, these pathways relate to that exactly. But anyway, so I like to model working memory as like a little octopus that's at the front of your brain. So I love speaking here in Singapore. Here's why. Okay, what do you call a person who speaks two languages? What do you call a person who speaks one language? An American, yes. So when I talk about working memory to Americans, I don't really have a handy thing, but for a bilingual person, as you are, if you're holding a sentence in mind and then you're translating it to another language, that's your working memory that's helping you do that holding in mind and translating. So you've got your working memory. It's taking in briefly the information being shared. Like right now, when I'm sharing with you, that information is going into your working memory, then it's going through the hippocampus into long-term memory. The other pathway, though, takes information, I'll call it the automatic pathway. It goes through the basal ganglia. So let's say that you are driving home. You drive home the very first time somebody gives you the instructions, you turn left here, you turn right here, and so forth. But after you've done it dozens of times, what happens is you get this automatic set of links, and you could practically drive home with your eyes closed. You just do it naturally. So anything you do a lot, your brain kind of moves over a new set of links that helps you do it without even thinking about it, because why bother? You can use your cognitive resources on things that are not so usual. Now, interestingly, your basal ganglia system is very strong in young people. So that's why young people can learn languages so much more easily, because that is the heart of the system that allows you to learn languages. So as you grow older, that hippocampal declarative system comes on stronger. That automatic system lessens, although it's still there. And that forms part of the difference in how we are learning about things. But the fact of the matter is, you need both systems, both types of links, because they each have slightly different characteristics. So let's look at this from a slightly different perspective. I want to see that blue box represents the declarative hippocampal system. And that orange box represents that automatic basal ganglia system. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at those two systems and see how they analyze things when you're thinking. So your working memory, you are conscious of your working memory. You're using your hippocampus. It is conscious as well. So let's say you're solving a math problem. So your working memory says, okay, I want to solve the math problem. You work through the steps and you're aware of what you're doing, and then it comes back and says, okay, I finished the math problem. But now, that hippocampal declarative way of thinking. But let's look now at the other system. Now, this is how the other system works. So, what is the main sport that's popular here that involves a ball? Is it baseball? Soccer? Okay, soccer. So let's say that my working memory, so what I tell myself is, okay, I want to kick the soccer ball, right? So what you're doing is, inside, your brain is going, hey, buddy, to the basal ganglia. It's saying, hey, I want you to kick the soccer ball. And then somehow that basal ganglia kind of figures out how to kick the soccer ball. It's magic. And then you see the result. Oh, I kicked the soccer ball. And you do it again. You kick the soccer ball. You kick it, and you're gradually learning how to kick the soccer ball. But you are not consciously aware of how you're learning to kick the soccer ball. Every time you tell yourself to kick it, you see the outcome, but you don't know how you learned it. What is going on in that magical basal ganglia system that is allowing you to learn how to kick a soccer ball? It is a deep neural net. And when I say, so those little circles are neurons. And the lines in between them are like the dendrites and the axons that are connecting. So it's the connections and the neurons themselves. So when I say it's a deep neural network, I mean there's a layer of neurons. So there's many layers of neurons. And that is modeled after how the human brain actually works. In fact, when they were first trying to figure out how can we develop artificial intelligence, they just had one layer. And then they got 2 layers, but they didn't have feedback. And then they kind of figured out, wait a minute, we can put more layers in, we can have feedback, feed forward, and if we just copy how the brain learns, we can develop artificial intelligence. And indeed, underlying generative AI is this whole idea of deep neural networks. So when you're learning things, you get an output. So let's say you kick the soccer ball, you try it once. Then you kick it again. Then you kick it again. Each time, you're training your neural net, and what's called the value function is when you are kind of realizing, did I successfully kick it or did I not? You're learning from that. So now watch that green line. As you're learning, see how it gets stronger. And there's the blue line up there. See, it gets stronger. You're training. You're making some network connections thicker. Other ones, you're making thinner. And all of this training is remarkably similar to how large language models are created and trained. The 2 fields of generative AI and AI itself and neuroscience they have grown hand in hand through the decades. Because when AI researchers would get stuck, they'd say, well, how do we do this? They'd go and talk to neuroscientists to find out how the brain did it. And then when brain scientists would get stuck, they'd go and talk to artificial intelligence. So Terry is the director of the Computational Neuroscience Laboratory. He's one of only 12 living human beings, incidentally, who's a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, Medicine, and Engineering. And his expertise is really grounded in both artificial intelligence and neuroscience. And that's where a lot of the success of his research has come from. So, but here's the interesting thing. We know now that the brain has these two systems of learning. It amazes me sometimes. You look in the educational textbooks, aside from uncommon sense teaching, and there's no mention of these two enormously different systems that neuroscientists know a lot about and that really impact our ability to interact with the world and to learn. But so we've got these two different systems, and what happens in a human, for example, who gets their hippocampus knocked out? Well, this is what happens in Alzheimer's. And what happens when you get that declarative conscious system kind of gradually destroyed is that people will start to make things up. They will confabulate. So my father, bless his soul, he had Alzheimer's. And here's the kind of thing he would do. He would come up to me and he'd say, "Barb, you have so many birdhouses at your house." And we're like, we have one birdhouse. And he's like, "No, you have lots of them. I'll show you." And so we go outside, and he goes and he points to the birdhouse, and then he goes, "See, there's one." And then he goes just like this, and he goes, "See, there's another one right there." And if you don't have that conscious, functional, hippocampal declarative system, you can make things up, and there's nothing overriding it to say, no, it doesn't make sense. So what is this like? It's just like how large language models, which only have that big basal ganglia-like system available, it's not conscious. And that is why it can sometimes just make stuff up. So that's a bad feature of generative AI. But there's other bad features, especially if you're an educator. Generative AI has pulled the rug out from under us as educators. We can no longer give essays or homework, and be sure that our students are going to go off and do that all by themselves. So what does this mean? It means you are even more important as teachers. Students throughout time have always used every trick at their disposal to avoid working hard. Now they've got a few more tricks. So we have to be on our game to ensure that they are still getting those links in long-term memory. Because if you want to think critically about the results of generative AI, you have to have knowledge in your own head. That is at the heart of critical thinking. So I want to give you a quick example of why it's even more important than you might think, your work as teachers. So from the 1930s through the 1970s, there's something called the Flynn effect, where it was found that IQ scores were going up worldwide. Why was this? I mean, IQ scores are going up, and researchers looked at why, and they concluded it was the education system. Increasing educational opportunities for students were causing them to become even smarter. Except, since the 1970s, IQ scores worldwide, as it turns out, have been declining. Why? And what happened in the 1970s that might have caused this? Well, guess what? In the 1970s, calculators came out. And when calculators came out, teachers started, and educators and psychologists started saying, you don't need to remember it, you can always look it up. No more memorization of the multiplication tables. When you don't memorize the multiplication tables, what happens? You are not developing that basal ganglia intuitive understanding of how numbers relate to one another. So they threw the baby out with the bathwater. All rote learning is bad. No, all rote learning is not bad. Some of it helps train that automatic system, and that is of great value. So now, your work as educators is all the more important. We do not want to have further decline in IQ because people are saying, oh, you don't need to know how to write an essay now because ChatGPT can do it for you. No, you still need to learn the essence of how to write a paper, how to do fundamental calculations, and you need to be able to do them very well. Singapore, part of its brilliance in the educational system, you don't necessarily teach a lot of stuff, but you teach the foundations, the really important things, really well, and you have not forgotten that in your school system. So let's go back and look now at that overview of some of the large language models. And if you want to, wait a minute and I'll tell you when to take a picture because there's like such good, there's so much stuff that's gonna grow on this slide and I'll tell you when to photograph it. So if you look, I'm going to center now more on Western large language models, Western engines, because I'm just more familiar with them. Now, we know that there's lots of apps that grow from these large language models. Most of them grow from ChatGPT because ChatGPT was first out of the gate. So let's look at some of these apps that have grown out so you can kind of get a feel for how they relate to one another. So if you look at writing assistants, there's really nice writing assistants. I've given 4 here because I can fit 4 in right there. There's many of them. These are some of the most popular. I kind of like WriteSonic because you can load a research paper and ask it to write a podcast article, and it will come back with a podcast script that it sounds like, well, then I was sitting in the lab, and like that day it's very casual. It's very much like a real podcast. How they do that, I have no idea, but it's worth investigating some of these. But I also want to share about the idea of a rapper. So I'm not talking about a singer rapper. I'm talking about a wrapper around a piece of candy, that kind of wrapper. As it turns out, these apps, they wrap around, for example, ChatGPT. And they just give you a dashboard interface, but underneath the engine is ChatGPT, or sometimes you can select different underlying engines. Now, Jasper, the one that's on the bottom there, it's sort of getting a little in trouble because people are realizing that you can just go directly to ChatGPT or Claude and not have their interface isn't maybe as useful as you might think it is. The reality is we can't keep going and buying, access to ChatGPT and Claude and Jasper and all these different things. The only way we can buy them is if they're really, really worth our money. So what you want to do is play with some of the different free versions and just see if it's worth looking at. Research has a gigantic basketful of different, this is just a small listing of some of the most popular. I particularly like that one Site, SCITE _. So where is that laser coming from? You are like so good. Yeah, no, I'll leave it to you because you're like faster than I am on these things. So I really like Site because you can go in it, and what they've done is well, first off, most of these are trained on research rather than just the web. So Semantic Scholar, for example, is trained on over 200 million. So when they're creating those neural nets and training them, they're training them to predict from what is going on from real research papers. That's very, very different than, like, there's lots of garbage on the web. There's like joke websites, which is why Gemini's predecessor was coming out and saying, to get a nutritious pizza, put rocks in it. And it was picking that up from a joke website, but it didn't know the difference. So these research apps are often, they're trained on better material, but like Scite, it does its analysis by first going out, you ask it a question, it will draw up what is going on in research and give you a really nice list of relevant citations, but then it also goes and checks the citations. So it has part of the LLM is creating, part of it is checking. And you can see it creating, checking. It's kind of cool to watch. And it will come up with a much better list that is more appropriate. There was one Canadian airline company that had a bot that had read all the materials on the company's website. It responded to a person who had queried about getting a refund on a plane ticket. It said, oh, that's, you should get a refund, and it gave him $800 of refund. Well, then the company looked at it and said the bot read that incorrectly. It was hallucinating the response because it wanted to please the client, and it shouldn't have given that $800 back. So the client or the customer who had bought the tickets sued, and it all went to court, and ultimately the airline company was found at fault, because if that bot was representing them, it had to be giving factual information. So in a similar way for us as researchers, we are writing things and we're responsible, for whatever we're presenting as being factually correct. So we have to be a little careful, but these help you to get better inputs. There's live to internet, like Copilot. I do suggest take care with these PowerPoint presentations. They are like so generic. Can you imagine this presentation if I told it to create, one of these PowerPoint presenters to create a presentation for me? It wouldn't be as exciting, as innovative. It gives you walls of bullet points and generic pictures. So I am a little careful with PowerPoint creators. There's lots of stuff for teachers and instructors. For example, you can take pictures of your notes and ask it to create a lesson plan for you. Now, the great thing is if you're working with Coursera, what I love is they have a course builder, and if you want, you can take your course in marketing or AI or whatever, put your notes in, and then ask it also to get little bits of video that is from top instructors around the world that enhance what you are saying. So it's kind of like these, but even better to my mind, especially for university teachers. There's creative productivity platforms like Canva and Gamma, and then there's lots of imagery. So some of it comes from ChatGPT with DALL-E. Others are independent, but they, of course, can make some wonderful imagery. I was trying to find an image of a teacher with the rug being pulled out from under them. Good luck. ChatGPT just generated it. And then, and Gemini has got some strong contenders with Runway, and also with their video. So there's cool stuff going on in video. If you're a history teacher, use some of these pictures, and you can say, I want a photorealistic picture of Ibn Khaldun from the 1400s, and boom, you've got it. So all of this arises. It's inspired in part by the wonderful book Teaching with AI by Bowen and Watson. If you're interested in using generative AI in your teaching, I highly recommend that book. Then there's also other books. Oh, heck, I'll put them all up there. So, now for some reason I am a little biased for Coursera. So if you're looking for good courses, these are some really terrific courses, and there's a lot more. If you're looking for leadership in Gen AI, you can find leadership in Gen AI, marketing, and so forth. Jules White has a plethora of courses. His course, Prompt Engineering for ChatGPT, is one of the most popular courses on Coursera now. And Jules and I are actually putting together, so right at the end of this month or beginning of the next, so in the next few days, we're going to be launching Accelerate Your Learning with ChatGPT. So what I've talked about here today just gives you a small sample of the far more copious amounts of information that relate to how you can use generative AI. And there is also a Mandarin version of learning how to learn. So with that, I would just like to thank you so much for your attention. And let's see, back to you, Michael? Yeah, okay.